The old wooden bridge groaned under the weight of the buggy, casting long shadows across the creek below. Hannah knew she shouldn't stop. The sun was already dipping below the cornfields, and her dad would be watching the lane. But her heart hammered against her ribs as she saw it. The loose stone in the bridge wall was pulled out just an inch. Someone had been there. Trembling, she reached into the darkness of the stone crevice, and her fingers brushed against a folded piece of paper. It was a letter that could ruin her reputation or save her soul. The autumn wind swept across the valley of Holmes County, carrying the scent of dried corn and damp earth. It was the time of harvest, when the days grew shorter and the lanterns were lit earlier in the evening. For Hannah Yoder, it was the most beautiful time of year, filled with the promise of rest after hard labor. She stood by the kitchen window, watching the golden leaves drift down from the great oak tree in the front yard. Her hands were covered in flour, moving rhythmically as she kneaded the dough for the week's bread. The house was quiet, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, marking the slow passing of the afternoon. Her mom was in the cellar, arranging the jars of pickled beets and peaches they had canned yesterday. Hannah wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a faint streak of white flour on her skin. Today was a special day, though not for the reasons her parents would have liked or even suspected. It was market day in town, but more importantly, there was a wedding in the neighboring district tomorrow. That meant the young people would gather tonight for the singing, a rare chance for social time. Hannah's heart did a little flutter, a feeling she tried to suppress with a quick, silent prayer for humility. She knew she shouldn't be looking forward to it so much, especially not because of him. Levi Mast. The name alone felt heavy in this house, like a forbidden word that hung in the air. The Yoders and the Masts had not spoken a friendly word in 20 years, divided by a bitter feud. It was an old dispute over a property line and a drainage ditch, something that seemed so small now to the younger generation. But in the Amish community, where memory is long and pride can be stubborn, the silence had hardened like concrete. Hannah's father, Abram, was a man of few words, but his dislike for Levi's father was absolute. Solomon Mast was a deacon, a strict man who believed he was always right and held the community to a rigid standard. And yet, his son Levi was different. He had a gentleness in his eyes that didn't match his father's stern scowl. Hannah had seen him at the last frolic, helping the men lift the heavy timber beams. She finished kneading the bread and covered the bowl with a clean linen cloth to let it rise. Hannah, her father's voice boomed from the back porch, breaking her reverie. She jumped slightly, smoothing her apron before hurrying to the door. "Coming, Dad!" she called out, her voice soft and respectful as was expected of her. She walked out to the porch, where the cool air nipped at her cheeks and reddened her nose. Her father was holding a broken harness strap, his face clouded with frustration and worry. "The leather is cracked through," he grumbled, looking out at the fields where the work was waiting. "I need to take the buggy to the shop. I cannot spare the time with the corn still standing in the lower field," he continued, rubbing his beard. Hannah hesitated. Ten spoke up, seeing an opportunity. "I can take it dead. I need to go to the dry goods store for thread anyway, and I can drop the harness off." Abram looked at her, his blue eyes narrowing slightly under the brim of his straw hat as he considered. He didn't like his daughter going into town alone too often, preferring her to stay close to home. But the harvest waited for no man, and he needed that harness fixed immediately. "All right," he nodded curtly, "but go straight there and back, and stay away from the Mast farm on the way," he added, his voice dropping to a warning growl. Hannah nodded, lowering her eyes submissively. "Yes." Dead. She hitched up the horse, a gentle mare named Bessie, and climbed into the open buggy, her heart beating a little faster. As she trotted down the long gravel driveway, she felt a sense of freedom wash over her. The clip-clop of Bessie's hooves on the pavement was a steady, comforting rhythm that calmed her nerves. She passed the neat rows of corn shocks, standing like soldiers in the fields, guarding the harvest. As she rounded the bend near the creek, she saw a buggy coming the other way. It was an open courting buggy, distinct and well-maintained, with fresh black paint. Her breath hitched in her throat. It was Levi. He was alone, driving a spirited black gelding that tossed its head impatiently. Hannah gripped the reins tighter, her knuckles turning white against the black leather. The rules of their families said she should look away, stare straight ahead, and pretend he didn't exist. But as they drew closer, the pull was magnetic. She couldn't help it. Salute, up. Levi was looking right at her, his gaze intense and unwavering. He didn't smile broadly, but his eyes crinkled at the corners in a way that warmed her soul. He lifted 2 fingers from the steering Honda Sattel, silent greeting that only she would notice. Hannah felt a blush creep up her neck, hot and sudden. She gave a tiny nod, barely perceptible, before casting her eyes back to the road ahead. They passed each other in seconds, the wheels spinning in opposite directions, carrying them apart. But the moment hung in the air long after he was gone, a silent promise between them. That brief connection sparked a hope in her chest that she knew was dangerous. Winter came early that year, wrapping Holmes County in a thick blanket of white snow. The drifts piled high against the barn doors, and the ponds froze over into solid sheets of gray ice. The work on the farm slowed down, moving from the fields to the barns and the warmth of the workshop. For Hannah, the winter meant quilting and long hours spent indoors with her thoughts. She sat by the wood stove in the evenings, her needle flashing in the lamplight as she stitched. Her mother sat opposite her, mending socks, while her father read the German Bible aloud to the family. It was a peaceful scene, one that had played out for generations in this house. But Hannah's mind was often miles away, wandering down the snowy lane to the Mast farm. Since that day on the road, she and Levi had found a way to communicate, defying the silence. It was reckless, she knew, and the guilt gnawed at her during Sunday service. If the bishop found out, they would be admonished and possibly put under the ban. If her father found out, the consequences would be severe, perhaps unforgivable. But love, once planted, is a stubborn root that grows even in the dark. Between the Yoder farm and the Mast farm, there was an old covered bridge spanning the creek. It was known locally as the Kissing Bridge, though the elders frowned on the name and its implications. Inside the bridge, near the third support beam, there was a loose stone in the foundation wall. It created a small, dry hollow, perfectly hidden from sight by the heavy timbers. Every Tuesday, when Levi drove the milk truck to the cheese factory, he would stop there. And every Wednesday, when Hannah walked to her aunt's house to help with cleaning, she would check the stone. Tonight, under the guise of needing fresh air, she slipped out to the porch. She checked her pocket, feeling the crinkle of the paper there that she had retrieved earlier. Shivering in the cold, she unfolded the note by the light of the moon, reflecting off the snow. Levi's handwriting was blocky and firm, much like the man himself, yet filled with tenderness. Hannah, it read, "The winter is long without seeing your face. My father speaks of buying land in Indiana. He wants to expand the herd and move us away from here." Hannah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. "My heart is heavy thinking of leaving this valley," the letter continued. "I pray for a thaw, not just in the ground, but in our fathers' hearts. Yours, L." Hannah pressed the note to her chest, closing her eyes tight. Indiana. It felt like the other side of the world to someone who had never left Ohio. If Levi moved away, she might never see him again, and her life would turn gray forever. She knew she had to write back tonight to give him a reason to stay. She slipped back inside, careful to be quiet as she passed her parents' bedroom door. In the safety of her room, she lit a small candle, shielding the flame with her hand. She took a scrap of paper and a pencil from her sewing drawer, her hand trembling. "Levi," she wrote, "do not lose hope. The Lord works in mysterious ways. My father is stubborn, but he loves the land and he respects hard work. He would miss you even if he would never admit it. I will pray for us. Please, do not go to Indiana without saying goodbye." She folded the paper into a tiny square, sealing her hope inside it. Tomorrow, she would find a reason to walk to the bridge, perhaps claiming she lost a mitten. The deception weighed on her. The Amish way was one of truth and transparency. Living a double life felt like a stone in her stomach, heavy and sharp. One afternoon, a few weeks later, the snow began to melt under a warm sun. The roads turned to slush and mud, making travel difficult for the buggies. Hannah was walking back from the bridge, the new note safely delivered into the stone wall. She heard the sound of a buggy coming up behind her, the wheels crunching in the slush. She moved to the side of the road to let it pass, keeping her head down. But the buggy slowed down instead of passing, the horse blowing air through its nose. She looked up, and her heart stopped in her chest. It was Deacon Solomon Mast, Levi's father. He pulled the horse to a halt, the wheels grinding in the gravel as he stared down at her. He was a large man with a gray beard that reached his chest, his face stern. He looked down at Hannah from the high seat of the buggy, his eyes sharp and missing nothing. "Hannah Yoder," he said, his voice like gravel, devoid of warmth. "Good afternoon, Deacon Mast," she whispered, clutching her shawl tightly around her shoulders. "You are far from home," he observed, glancing back toward the bridge she had just left. "I was visiting my aunt," she lied. The lie tasted sour on her tongue. Solomon stared at her for a long moment, his gaze piercing. He looked back toward the covered bridge, then back at her, connecting the dots. He didn't say anything else, but the silence was louder than shouting. He simply clicked his tongue at the horse and drove on, leaving her standing in the mud. Hannah stood there, her knees shaking, knowing that her secret was no longer safe. Spring arrived with a burst of rain and thunder, washing away the last of the snow. The creeks swelled, rushing brown and angry beneath the bridges, threatening to flood. The tension in the Yoder household was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Hannah had been careful. She hadn't left a note in 2 weeks, fearing the deacon. She hoped that Deacon Mast had forgotten seeing her, or that he hadn't checked the bridge. But secrets in a small community are like seeds. Eventually, they sprout and reveal themselves. It was a Sunday evening, usually a time of rest and family reflection. The family had just returned from church service, which was held at the Miller farm that week. Abram sat at the head of the table, his face grim and set like stone. He didn't eat his supper, staring blankly at the wall. Hannah picked at her pot pie, her stomach in knots, sensing the storm about to break. Finally, Abram pushed his plate away with a clatter that made them all jump. "Hannah," he said. The room went deadly silent. The air suddenly sucked out of it. Her mother, Sarah, stopped wiping the counter and turned around, her eyes wide with worry. "Yes, dead?" Hannah asked, her voice barely a whisper, trembling with fear. Abram reached into his coat pocket, his movements slow and deliberate. He pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, worn at the edges. Hannah's blood ran cold. It was one of her notes, the very one she had hidden. "Deacon Mast gave this to me after the service today," Abram said, his voice shaking with suppressed anger. "He found it in the bridge. He saw his son putting a reply there, and he took it." Hannah couldn't breathe. The room seemed to spin around her. "He asked me if I knew my daughter was chasing his son," Abram continued, his voice rising. "He asked me if I had no control over my own household. shaming me before the church. This was the worst part for Abram, the public shame, the blow to his reputation. I didn't mean to. ... Hannah started, tears welling in her eyes, hot and stinging. Didn't mean to. Abram slammed his hand on the table, making the silverware rattle. You are writing letters to a boy? A boy whose father has insulted our family for years. He is not his father, Hannah cried out, a sudden burst of courage rising in her chest. Levi's good. He is kind. He loves God. You don't know him. He is a Mast, Abram shouted back, his face turning red with fury. And as long as you live under my roof, you will have nothing to do with him. Sarah came over and put a hand on Abram's shoulder, trying to soothe him. Abram, calm down, she said softly. Think of your heart. Calm down. The deacon threatened to bring this to the bishop, Abram said, pacing the floor. Do you know what that means? A confession before the church. The shame of it. He looked at Hannah with eyes she had never seen before, eyes full of disappointment. You will not leave this farm, he ordered, pointing a finger at her. You will not go to You will not go to town alone ever again. And if I see him near this property, I will run him off with a shotgun. Hannah fled to her room, sobbing uncontrollably. She threw herself onto a quilt, the one she was making for her future marriage chess. It felt like a mockery now, a symbol of a future she could not have. She cried until her throat burned and her eyes were swollen shut. Later that night, her mother came in quietly, carrying a kerosene lamp. She sat on the edge of the bed and stroked Hannah's hair, her touch gentle. Oh, Hannah, she whispered, why didn't you tell me? Why did you hide this? Because I knew you would stop it. Hannah wept into her pillow. We love him, Ongim. We truly do. He understands me like no one else, Sarah sighed. A long, weary sound that carried the weight of years. Love is not always enough, child. Not in our world, Sarah explained sadly. We are bound by the community, by the ordnan. To defy your father is to defy God's order. You must give him up, she said firmly but kindly. There is no other way. The weeks that followed were gray and endless, blending into a haze of sorrow. Hannah was a prisoner in her own home, watched constantly by her father. She worked harder than she ever had before, trying to exhaust herself so she could sleep. She scrubbed the floors until the wood turned white and her knees ached. She weeded the garden until her hands were blistered and raw, pulling every weed with vengeance. She tried to pray the feelings away, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw Levi. She heard through her mother that Levi had been sent away immediately. Solomon Mast had made good on his threat to separate them. Levi was sent to an uncle's farm in Indiana, 300 miles away from Holmes County. He was sent there to straighten out, to work hard, and forget the Yoder girl. The news broke Hannah's spirit completely. He was gone. He hadn't had a chance to say goodbye, or to tell her he loved her one last time. The summer dragged on, hot and humid. The air heavy with moisture. The corn grew tall, rustling in the breeze, mocking her with its vitality. Hannah went through the motions of life, but the light had gone out of her eyes. She lost weight. Her dresses hung loosely on her frame, and her face grew pale. The community noticed the change in the vibrant girl they once knew. At church, women would whisper behind their hands, casting pitying glances at her. Poor thing, they would say softly. Heartbroken. It is a sickness of the spirit. But no one intervened. The will of the Father was law, and the privacy of the family was sacred. One sweltering afternoon in July, Hannah was in the barn, milking the cows. The air was thick with flies and the smell of silage, stifling and hot. She pressed her forehead against the warm flank of the cow, tears sliding down her nose. Lord, she prayed, please, Take this pain away, or bring him back. I cannot bear this silence, she whispered to the empty barn. She heard a noise at the barn door, a scuffing of boots. She wiped her eyes quickly, thinking it was her father coming to check on her. But when she turned, it was a young boy, her cousin, Amos. He looked nervous, glancing over his shoulder to make sure the coast was clear. "Hannah," he hissed, signaling her to come closer. "Amos, what are you doing here? Dad will be angry if he sees you interrupting chores." Amos reached into his pocket, his eyes wide with conspiracy. "I have something for you," he whispered, stepping into the shadows. He pulled out a small wooden carving wrapped in a scrap of cloth. It was a bird, a cardinal, carved from aromatic cedar wood. It was exquisite. Every feather was detailed, the beak perfectly shaped and stained red. Anna gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. She knew who made this. Levi was a woodworker. It was his gift, his passion. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her hands trembling as she took it. "A man brought it from Indiana." Amos whispered fast. "He said Levi Mast sent it. He said to tell you he is building a house, and that the front door faces east, towards Ohio," Amos added. Hannah clutched the wooden bird to her chest, shutting her eyes tight against the flood of emotion. He hadn't forgotten. He was waiting for her. He was building a life for them. But what could she do? The choice was agonizing. If she ran away to Indiana, she would be shunned by everyone she knew. She would lose her family, her community, everything she had ever known and loved. She would be an outcast, cut off from the vine. But staying here meant a life of gray obedience, married eventually to someone she did not love. The conflict tore at her soul, keeping her awake night after night. That night, a summer storm began to brew, turning the sky an ominous green. The wind whipped the trees into a frenzy, bending the saplings to the ground. It was one of those summer storms that come out of nowhere, violent and fast. Abram was out in the fields, trying to get the last wagon of hay into the barn before the rain. Hannah and her mother watched from the kitchen window, fear growing in their hearts. "It's going to be a bad one," Sarah said, watching the lightning fork across the sky. Suddenly, a crack of thunder shook the house, rattling the dishes in the cupboard, and then a terrifying sound, the sound of wood splintering and crashing. The barn. Hannah screamed. Seeing the flash of light, they ran out to the back porch, heedless of the driving rain. The great barn, the heart of the farm, had been struck by lightning. Smoke was already curling from the roof, and flames were licking at the dry hay in the loft. "Dead!" Hannah screamed, running into the rain toward the inferno. The heat pushed her back, but she could see her father trying to open the stable doors. The next hour was a blur of chaos, terror, and adrenaline. Neighbors saw the smoke rising against the storm clouds and came running from all directions. Men arrived with buckets, boys with shovels, driving their buggies at breakneck speeds. The fire alarm bell rang out across the valley, a mournful, urgent sound. They managed to get the animals out just in time. Bessie the mare, the dairy cows, the calves were all led into the pasture, safe but terrified. But the barn itself could not be saved. The fire was too hot, the wind too strong. The fire, fed by the dry hay and seasoned timber, consumed the structure with a roaring hunger. Abram stood in the rain, his face soot-stained, watching his livelihood burn to the ground. He looked smaller than Hannah had ever seen him, stripped of his pride and strength. Defeated. By morning, only the stone foundation and the charred skeleton of the timbers remained. The Yoder family sat in their kitchen, exhausted, wet, and silent. They had lost the hay, the grain, and the farming equipment. Without a barn, the farm could not function. They were facing financial ruin, but the Amish way is not one of despair, but of community and mutual aid. By noon, the bishop arrived at the front door, his face grave but kind. "We will rebuild." Esai, simply putting a hand on Abram's shoulder. "A barn raising. We will set the date for next Tuesday." Word went out to the entire settlement, spreading like ripples in a pond. On the day of the raising, buggies lined the road for a mile in both directions. Hundreds of men arrived with tool belts, saws, and hammers. Women arrived with baskets of food to feed the workers, turning tragedy into a gathering. It was a spectacle of unity, a testament to their way of life. And among the men who arrived, coming from the Mast farm, was Solomon, and with him was Levi. He had come back from Indiana when he heard the news of the fire. Hannah saw him from the kitchen window, and her heart nearly leaped out of her chest. He looked older, leaner, his face tanned from working outdoors. He was unloading lumber from a wagon, moving with strength and purpose. Her heart hammered, but she stayed inside, helping the women cook the noon meal. The men worked in unison, a massive, coordinated effort. It was a dangerous ballet. Men walking on high beams, hammering, lifting walls into place. By mid-afternoon, the frame was up, a skeleton of fresh, yellow wood against the sky. Abram was up on the high beam, securing a main rafter. He was tired, his movements slow after the stress of the past week. Suddenly, his foot slipped on the fresh wood. There was a collective gasp from the crowd below as he lost his footing. Abram flailed, trying to grab the beam, teetering on the edge of a 30-foot drop. A hand shot out strong, fast, and sure. It grabbed Abram's suspenders and hauled him back against the timber before he could fall. It was Levi Mast. He had been working right next to him, watching out for him. For a moment, the two men stood there on the high beam, suspended between the sky and the earth. Levi held Abram steady until he regained his footing, his grip firm. Abram looked into the face of the boy he had forbidden his daughter to see, the boy whose father was his enemy, yet who had just saved his life, and he saw only fear and concern in Levi's eyes. No malice, no triumph. "Are you all right, Abram?" Levi asked, his voice steady and respectful. Abram nodded, unable to speak, his throat tight with emotion. He gripped Levi's shoulder for a second gesture of thanks that spoke volumes. Down on the ground, Hannah let out a breath she didn't know she was holding, tears streaming down her face. Solomon Mast had seen it too. He was standing near the water cooler, watching his son save his enemy. The tension in the air shifted, softening like the earth after a rain. Something had broken in that moment, not a bone, but a barrier of pride. Later that evening, when the work was done and the frame stood proud, the families ate together. Abram walked over to where Solomon was standing by his buggy. The crowd went quiet, watching the two patriarchs. Abram held out his hand, his palm calloused and rough. "Your son has a strong arm," Abram said loud enough for others to hear, "and a good heart. He saved me today." Solomon looked at the hand, then at Abram, his eyes misty. He took it, a firm, rough shake that ended the 20-year silence. "He takes after his mother," Solomon grunted, a hint of a smile in his beard. Abram turned to look for Levi, who was standing by the fence. He beckoned him over, and Levi approached slowly, hat in hand. Then Abram turned and called toward the porch, "Anna." Hannah walked down the steps, her legs feeling like jelly, her heart pounding. She stood before her father, terrified but hopeful. "The barn is built," Abram said softly, looking at the fresh timber. "It is a new beginning for this farm." He looked at Levi, at Anna, seeing the love between them. "I think," Abram said, clearing his throat, "that perhaps Indiana is too far for a good carpenter to live. We have plenty of work here in Holmes County. I could use a man with your skills." Levi smiled. A wide, genuine smile that lit up his face. "I think you're right, Abram," Levi said, his eyes locking with Hannah's. Hannah looked at her father, tears streaming down her face, freely now. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered, her voice choked with gratitude. Abram nodded, turning away to hide the mist in his own eyes. "Go on now," he said gruffly. "Show him the garden. It needs weeding." 5 years later, the Yoder farm is thriving, more beautiful than ever. The new barn, now weathered to a soft gray, stands strong against the wind. On the porch of a small daughter house built on the edge of the property, Hannah sits in a rocking chair. It is evening. The fireflies are beginning to dance over the cornfields, blinking like stars. She is quilting, stitching a pattern of interlocking rings, the symbol of marriage. A little boy, barely 3 years old, toddles across the porch, laughing. "Mangem, mangem," he cries, pointing to the lane with a chubby finger. A buggy is turning in, the horse trotting briskly. It is Levi, home from the workshop, his silhouette framed by the setting sun. He parks the buggy and walks up the steps, dusting sawdust from his trousers. He picks up the boy and swings him into the air, making him giggle with delight. Then he turns to Hannah, his eyes full of the same warmth she fell in love with. He doesn't say a word. He just rests his hand on her shoulder and squeezes gently. She looks up at him, her eyes full of peace and deep contentment. The feud is a distant memory, a story told to warn against the hardening of hearts. Here, in the quiet of the evening, there is only the sound of the crickets. The smell of the harvest surrounds them, a testament to God's provision. The road had been long and the valley deep, filled with shadows. But the bridge they built not of wood, but of faith and love had held them up. Anna smiled, picked up her needle, and took another stitch. The life was simple, hard, and plain, but it was good.